Well, I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for the invitation to be here, and thank you for coming to listen. I do feel like I have a fairly ambitious agenda, especially given that I've got maybe 35 minutes to talk to you. And really, the goal is to help you to form or develop, or for some of you to deepen a new mental category or concept. Okay. And that is the concept or category of intellectual character and intellectual virtue. And what I'm going to suggest is that this is a category that, if you've got your kind of conceptual map before your mind here, it's a category that lies between probably ordinary ways of thinking about character on the one hand, and then ways of thinking about intelligence and what it is to be smart or a good thinker on the other hand. Okay, so that's kind of where we're headed. Second thing I'd like to do is to address the importance of intellectual character and intellectual virtue to the enterprise of education and to Christian education in particular. So we'll jump right in and begin with a rough and ready definition of character. And this will be familiar, hopefully make sense to most of you. You can think of your character in general as how you are disposed or inclined to act, think, and feel across various domains of human life. So how are you disposed or inclined to behave? What sorts of thoughts or judgments are you inclined to make? How are you likely to be motivated or to feel when it comes to various important domains that are part of human life and existence? So put in that way, you can see that character is kind of a neutral term, right? Character can be good or bad. It can be better or worse. And typically, when we think about character, we think in particular about moral character or moral virtue. So if I asked you to name some virtues, you might say something, well, compassion or kindness or generosity. But the real point that I want to try to get across today is that moral character is not the only dimension of personal character. I'd like to encourage you to expand your understanding of personal character to include at least one other dimension beyond moral character. Okay, and this will be the dimension of intellectual character. And to kind of point you in the direction of what intellectual character is or involves or looks like, I'm going to read a fairly lengthy passage from an old novel, 1934, by an author named C.P. Snow called The Search. And the selection is from the opening lines of the novel. The novel as a whole is sort of chronicles the scholarly rise and fall of a character named Arthur Miles, who's a researcher at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And this opening scene is when he's 14 years old. So he's taking a walk with his father when he's 14 years old. Pay attention as I read to kind of actions, feelings, motivations, volition, intention. Look for kind of characterological language in the passage. When I was a child of about 11, a new excitement suddenly flared up in my life. This particular Sunday night was warm and twilight, and I fancy summer was nearly over. As we came to the end of town, the sun had just gone down behind the river, and I remember it as though it were yesterday. In the yellow sunset sky, there was a sickle of new moon, and high over our heads a sprinkling of stars just coming dimly out. We stopped and looked. My father said, "I wonder if they're what we think they are, stars like this." He waved vaguely. "People think we know about them. I wonder if we do." I gazed up at him. "I wonder if we can," he added. I didn't know what he was thinking. All of a sudden, I felt that all the things around me were toys to handle and control, that I had the power in a tiny, easy world. "I wonder if they are what we think they are," my father was saying again. "Let's find out," I said, and then, "I am going to find out." My father looked puzzled. "Well," he said, "the night had taken hold of me. I wanted to do something with those stars. I didn't quite know what, but I was elated. Their beauty stirred me. But it was not only that. If I had been older, I should have said I wanted to know, to understand, to alter. I wanted to rush out and have them for my own. I laughed. I'm going to find out all about them." What I love about this passage is that it unites so compellingly the language and concepts of character, of volition, and deep emotion, and intention, and action, with, in this case, kind of scientific or pre-scientific reflection. Right? It unites character and intellectual thought or scientific thought. And I've just highlighted on this slide here some of the red is sort of emotional, motivational language, and then the blue is more about kind of action or movement. So Arthur has an excitement that flares up in his mind. He stops, he looks. Wonder is in here about 4 or 5 times. He has strong feelings. He resolves to find out what these stars are really like. So again, what I'd like to take away from this is just the idea that for each of us, our intellectual character is the place in ourselves where personal character intersects not so much with how we treat our neighbor or whether we give to charity and so forth, but the place in ourselves where character intersects with our thought life, with how we think and reason and learn and judge and draw inferences and ask questions. Okay? And then intellectual virtues you can think of as the deep personal qualities or character traits of a good thinker or learner. So there's a dimension of ourselves where our character intersects with our ability and inclination to think and learn. And intellectual virtues are the deep personal qualities or character traits that we need in order to think or to learn well. Think for a moment about your best and brightest students and ask yourself, what are the qualities that they tend to possess? Your best and brightest students, and just think for a minute, try to kind of identify in your mind what are some qualities that they possess. And as you're doing that, I'll quickly share a true story about two students that I had in a logic course that I taught a few years ago. I think the name of the first person isn't right, and that's probably good for the purposes of anonymity. The second name is accurate. So this is a course in symbolic logic, which is much more like a math course than it is a regular philosophy course. You're building a proof system and doing proofs. And one of the students, Jacob, was what we often refer to as kind of a logic whiz. Everything came to him really quickly. I just have to explain it once, and he'd get it. Right? Everything, the content just clicked with him very, very naturally. He was very naturally very, very good and competent at logic. Shane, on the other hand, was one of these students who when you start to explain a new idea and you look at their face, they have just this sort of unmistakable look of puzzlement, right? And confusion. And And indeed, that's how Shane kind of experienced a lot of this subject matter. But instead of responding by kind of despairing or dropping the course or blowing it off, Shane moved from the sort of middle or back of the room to the front of the room. And he started coming to office hours, asking me questions after class, raising his hand in class and asking me to repeat things that weren't clear. Even more fascinating and memorable to me is that Shane used to ask really great, deep, thoughtful questions about logic, which doesn't often happen, right? You think about asking deep questions if you're in an English class or a history class or a science class. But you don't ask a lot of deep questions in a math class or a symbolic logic class. Shane had really terrific questions. He was willing to say about some of the principles and concepts we were studying, that's crazy, or that doesn't make sense, not because he didn't understand it, because he did understand it, right? How could these things be true? And he was also terrific at being able to make connections between things we were learning presently and things that we had learned at other times in the class. Connections I didn't even see or make myself. Shane would willingly volunteer to go and do proofs on the board, not because he knew that he knew how to do them, but as a way to kind of test whether he did know them. Fast forward to the end of the semester, or well, I'll say midway through the semester, Jacob started not coming to class because he felt like he didn't need to. He could just pick up the material in the book. Well, that didn't really turn out to be the case, and he ended up doing, I don't remember how he did in the end. He was doing poorly towards the end, tried to rescue his grade at the end of the semester, but overall did not fare well in the course. Shane, by contrast, just had a steady trajectory upward, right? He really came to master the material as well as anybody in the class, and ended up getting a very solid A in the class. So think about some of the qualities that each of them manifested, right? Shane, from the beginning, showed remarkable intellectual tenacity or grit. The way that he moved from the back of the class to the front of the class and sat there, with his eyes glued on me for the entire time, right, clearly checked into the process, demonstrated his attentiveness. He wasn't afraid to say, "I don't understand what you just said. Can you repeat that?" He was willing to acknowledge where he needed to work, what he didn't know. He also was intellectually courageous. Right? By asking questions that might make him look dumb in front of his peers, by going up to the board, not knowing whether he would be able to complete the proof that he'd been given or not. And then, of course, the terrific questions that he asked were just a wonderful illustration of curiosity, and then the way that he would make connections between the various points and really look to try to put them together into a big coherent whole demonstrated his intellectual thoroughness. Jacob, on the other hand, often inattentive. When he was in class, he'd be doing something else. Intellectual arrogance in some of his dispositions toward other students, and just thinking that he didn't have to be there at all. He was impatient with probably me and the course and his peers, and then kind of checked out eventually. So, the upshot then here is, again, that each of us possesses an intellectual character. You don't have the option of not having an intellectual character. Each of us possesses an intellectual character that, as I hope the story about those two students illustrates, that is at least largely distinct from our natural cognitive abilities, but that is also critically important to our success as thinkers, learners, students, researchers, inquirers, truth seekers. Okay. And intellectual virtues, again, are simply the excellences or strengths of intellectual character. Okay? So to try to put a little bit more flesh on some of these concepts and words, I'll quickly share with you talk very quickly about 9 virtues. And these happen to be the 9 virtues that we focus on at the Intellectual Virtues Academy, which again is a newish charter middle school in Long Beach. The whole kind of educational and instructional and cultural program of which revolves around intellectual character development, and we try to make that more concrete and specific by focusing on these 9 virtues. And it's middle school, so we've come up with little slogans for each of them, so I'll share those with you as well. And what we've done also to try to, 9 is a lot, so to try to make that simple is we've put them into 3 groups. The first 3 virtues are virtues that are required for getting the learning process started and headed in the right direction. So it won't surprise you that a fundamental kind of motivating virtue for students, for us as professors, is curiosity or inquisitiveness. Okay, the curious person is skilled at and disposed at asking good, thoughtful, insightful questions. Not enough, though, to just be curious. You also have to be able to think for yourself, to form your own judgments, to draw your own conclusions. You need to be, in a sense, intellectually self-governed or autonomous. But of course, autonomy can be taken too far, right? All of us need to know what our own cognitive limitations are. And we need to know who else to rely on and be willing to say, I don't know, I need help, this isn't something I understand, this isn't something that I'm good at, right? And so autonomy has to be balanced by intellectual humility. The second group of virtues are virtues that are, as we put it, kind of required for kind of keeping the learning process on track. These are virtues that kind of apply to the learning process as a whole. And these are virtues that are probably very familiar to you. You probably expect these from your students. Some of this language may be in the rubrics that you use to grade certain assignments and so forth. One is attentiveness. And by attentiveness, I don't primarily mean like sitting up straight and looking at the teacher, right? You could be sitting up straight and looking at the teacher while daydreaming or being mentally checked out or just sort of mentally dull. The attentive person is someone who is personally present in the learning process. Their mind isn't somewhere else. They're here. They're looking and they're listening. There's also close association between attentiveness and sort of focusing on and recognizing detail, which you tend to do when you're really checked in to what you're thinking about or learning about. Intellectual carefulness is a matter of being sort of alert to and being capable of and disposed to avoid mistakes or errors. So the intellectually careful thinker is someone who, whatever domain they're thinking about, they know what it takes to get things right, and they are quick to notice potential pitfalls, and they are skilled and have a habit of avoiding those mistakes. So they're very careful. And then intellectual thoroughness we think of as a virtue that involves kind of probing for deeper meaning and deeper understanding. And so there's a close association in our way of thinking about it between intellectual thoroughness and explanation. Most of us probably have students who are really good at memorizing information from handouts and PowerPoints and just regurgitating it on exams. But what hopefully we look for are students who can actually explain the material and explain it in their own terms and concepts. So thoroughness is a matter of probing for, desiring explanation. How do things fit together? How are they related to each other? And then also being able to communicate an explanation as well. So you can have a more or less thorough teacher, just like students who are trying to come to understand something can be more or less thorough in their attempts to understand it. The last set of virtues are each of them is geared toward overcoming a certain kind of obstacle or challenge to productive learning. So one challenge is that we face is often a tendency to think inside the box, right? That we've got our categories, we've got our way of thinking about things, and we aren't willing to listen to the other side, or we aren't willing to broaden our imagination about this or that. Our minds are firm, and our categories are calcified. Well, because that's a temptation and obstacle that many of us face, and because that can limit our ability to learn and grow intellectually, we need open-mindedness. One of the virtues that I think is most important in education, and I say this as both a university professor and then as someone who's done recent work with adolescents, is really intellectual courage. As in other areas of life, real growth comes through embracing challenges and being willing to take risks, right? And the intellectually courageous person is someone who is able and willing to take risks in the learning process. Finally, intellectual tenacity focuses on the experience of intellectual struggle. We all have students who, or ourselves can be such that when we encounter intellectual struggles, we encounter something we're not good at, that we don't understand, we just give up, right? Well, an intellectually tenacious person is someone who has the opposite reaction, right? They don't give up. They persist through an experience of intellectual struggle so that they can understand, so that they can learn, so that they can get to the truth. So those are 9. They are by no means an exhaustive list. Some of them we've defined in our own ways, but hopefully that gives you some sense of concrete sense of what intellectual virtues look like and kind of how they are important to even classroom teaching and learning. So I'll focus now in the time we have left on why I think educating for intellectual virtues, educating for intellectual character growth should be a central educational aim, especially for those of us who are interested in thinking about education from a even broadly Christian standpoint. So for Christians in particular, education is about more than the acquisition of knowledge and skills that are required for getting a job and having a good career. It's also about personal formation. This isn't an idea that would resonate everywhere. I'm confident it's an idea that would resonate here, that education, even undergraduate education, is also about personal development and personal formation. Well, our habits of mind, our intellectual character traits, are an important part of who we are as people. To say that someone is intellectually humble and inquisitive and tenacious is to say something about who that person is as a person. And it's to say something good or favorable. So, educating for intellectual virtues is a way of having a deep personal impact on our students, and importantly, it's a way of having that kind of impact that can be easily integrated with academic teaching and learning. The enterprise of character education has been around for a long time, and there's a lot of good work in that area, and it's important. But a lot of teachers, especially public school teachers, who are already overburdened in what's expected of them, often find it hard to think about how can I integrate a focus on kindness or compassion or citizenship into my math lesson or into my science lesson or something like that, right? It's not easy. It can be done. It's not easy, though, to integrate moral character education with academic teaching and learning. But it is easy, it is natural, if you think about it, to integrate a focus on wonder and curiosity and open-mindedness and intellectual courage and intellectual tenacity and intellectual carefulness and thoroughness, right? Those are things we can focus on while teaching our academic subject matter. So there are real opportunities for integrating character education with academic teaching and learning, particularly when we're thinking about intellectual character and intellectual virtues. Secondly, educating for intellectual character virtue is a way of equipping our students for wise, responsible living. It's not the same as moral character education, but think about this. Our actions and our choices they aren't formed in a vacuum. They don't emerge in a vacuum. Rather, they flow largely from our beliefs and from our thinking processes. Intellectual virtues, their role is to perfect and improve and enhance our thinking and belief-forming processes. As such, they provide us with a sound epistemic foundation for making informed, wise, responsible decisions, not just as thinkers and learners, but in all areas of life. And so, by educating for intellectual virtues, we can equip our students for wise, responsible living. That's not to say that if they're intellectually virtuous, they'll have all the moral virtues all figured out, but certainly if you just have goodwill or a good heart and don't have good judgment, or you're fundamentally misinformed, or you're lazy or narrow or hasty in how you form beliefs, your goodwill is probably not going to do as nearly as much good in the world as it would be if you were intellectually virtuous. There's a wonderful quote here. It's the only other long quote that I have, the only other quote, period. But I want to read it to you. It's from a book that I cannot recommend enough, especially to this crowd, called Virtuous Minds. I'll say a little bit about it at the end, by an author, Philip Dow. Here's what he has to say. Our intellectual character influences our lives just as moral character does, and with at least as much force. The only difference is that intellectual character is concerned not with our actions as much as it is with the thinking habits we are developing as we seek and use knowledge. Put another way, intellectual character is the force of accumulated thinking habits that shape and color every decision we make. Because our minds tend to lead our actions, in a very real sense, the quality of our intellectual character even trumps moral character in terms of its power to direct the course of our lives. We tend to think of our choices as isolated moments of decision in which we reason through the pros and cons before making the best choice we can based on the information that we have. In reality, most of the choices we make are not the result of conscious and deliberate reasoning. Whether it's a product of the flood of mental distractions and the frenetic busyness of our modern lives, or simply exhaustion, we end up making most of our choices on mental autopilot. We don't reason so much as react, and in this haste, we are usually forced to rely on the mental ruts our thinking patterns have produced. These mental ruts that our thinking naturally slips into are our intellectual character. Couldn't have said it better. Last kind of argument for integrating a focus on intellectual character development into into the practice of education actually concerns preparing our students for deeper faith. This is my favorite point here, and it's also maybe kind of the most complex, but I think it's the deepest and the most important one. And it's really something that, I've talked about this material a lot to a lot of different groups, and this is something that I've really only begun to make proper sense of recently. So at their foundation, intellectual virtues are marked by an openness toward and a willingness to submit one's mind to reality, to truth. The fundamental orientation of an intellectually virtuous person is that of being open toward, receptive to, being willing to submit one's mind to reality, to truth. The intellectually virtuous person doesn't try to create reality in their own image. Rather, they try to conform their minds to truth, to the way the world is. Well, God, including God's existence, love, and authority, are part of reality. They are part of reality. However, especially for creatures who are broken, selfish, who strive for control and autonomy, this reality can be easy to miss. It can make us inattentive to evidence for God in nature, in other people, in our conscience. But it can also prevent us from being properly oriented toward reality in another way. And this is what I want to dwell on for just a moment. As Christians, we view the good life, real flourishing, as living in humble, moment-by-moment dependence on God and the grace of God. But entering into that dependent relationship requires facing certain facts about ourselves. It requires not ignoring, not denying, not trying to justify our way out of the fact that we are broken, that we are finite, that we need God's mercy and grace. Those are uncomfortable facts. And there's no way to get to real flourishing, the life of faith, without acknowledging those. Okay? So in a way, our own brokenness is part of reality. It's truth as well. And so to confront that truth, to face the facts about our own need for God, and to face the reality of God's existence and the reality of God's authority, even the reality of God's love for us, we need to have certain habits of thinking. It's not enough just to have goodwill. We need to be intellectually honest, intellectually humble. We need to have intellectual integrity in order to face the facts about our need for God and to be open to God's authority and work in our lives. So there's a role that intellectual virtues have to play in helping us to face facts about ourselves and to face facts about God that are really critical to our own flourishing and our own well-being. And of course, all the same things apply to our students. And so educating for intellectual virtues is also a way of helping our students enter more deeply into the life of faith. If you'd like to learn more about some of these concepts, here are some recommended readings. One, like I mentioned, is by Phil Dow, called Virtuous Minds, Intellectual Character Development for Students, Educators, and Parents. If I were in charge of undergraduate education at Biola, and I have no doubt it's a good thing I'm not, I would make this book required reading for every freshman at the university. It's written for a broadly Christian audience, and it's all about intellectual character and the importance of intellectual character to the Christian life and to education. It's a terrific book. Full disclosure, I wrote the foreword for it, but only because I'm such a big fan of it, and Phil is a good friend of mine. It's really a wonderful work, especially for people interested in Christian education, Christian university education. A second thing, far less good and deep or rich, is something that I've just recently completed. It's about 10% of a larger project that I've also recently completed that's more geared toward middle school and high school teachers. But I have come up with a guide called Educating for Intellectual Virtues, a guide for college and university instructors. I really just kind of came up with the final version of it the other day. I was going to try to put it on my website before we got here today. I ran out of time, so I'll put it up there later today. It's really intended for the university or college instructor who says, okay, interesting ideas, like I'm sold. Like what would this look like for me as a university professor in my classroom? What are some concrete strategies? What are some resources that you can share? This guide is aimed at answering exactly that question. The last book is a book by a researcher at Project Zero, which is kind of an education research group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. It's called Intellectual Character: What It Is, Why It Matters, and How to Get It by Ron Richhart. It's written mainly for middle school and high school educators as well, but it's a really nice book. It talks about thinking dispositions, which are excellences of intellectual character. What he means by thinking dispositions are basically what I'm talking about as intellectual virtues. But it's very practical, very classroom-based, a really good work. That's it. Thank you.
That was when I began to get queasy, and it reminded me of Saruman, who would see a tree and think, oh, this is an orc waiting to happen. And this whole kind of modern project of knowing in order to control seemed to echo through that. So I just cheered.
All I can say is I agree with you. I wish that weren't there, because what it lacks is the sort of I use this word carefully and with some reservation, but it lacks this idea of submission, right? Control is very different from submission, right? So I wish that were there instead. I mean, you could try to, a sympathetic gloss on it might be that like he wanted to like personally interact with reality, not just view it from afar, but to personally interact with it and engage with it. But that may be a little too optimistic, because certainly there's a history there. Yeah.
On the second list toward the end, I think the first point was something, just the next one before that. Our actions and choices flow from our beliefs and thinking. As a cognitive psychologist, I think some would really embrace that, and yet I think like William James and a variety of other psychologists think something much more early is happening that leads to belief systems.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'm not a cognitive psychologist, and I actually like the balance, and this was occurring to me as I was talking through this, the balance between that statement there and then the quote from Phil Dow, where here he says a lot of it, just our actions kind of happen, right? But what I like is that intellectual character covers both of those sort of dimensions. On the one hand, it is something that our character manifests in the conscious reasoning that we undertake, trying to figure something out, trying to understand something, trying to reason through our way through something, right? Intellectual virtues manifest themselves in that kind of activity. But they are the settled habits of thinking that we have. And so they also manifest in sort of our reactionary ways of making judgments. Yes, absolutely. And I don't doubt at all that there are other things that figure into our formation and the formation of intellectual character, and personality is not unrelated to it. Yeah.
Just to jump off that, some of the research on integrated complexity talks about thinking processes as being embodied and being contextually grounded.
Yeah.
So depending on, a good example is politicians say very simplistic kinds of things before the election, very complex things, thoughtful things after the election.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that that's critical in terms of what you're talking about in teaching kids who come from disadvantaged environments.
Yeah.
How do they get to these intellectual
Yeah.
virtues and the expression of these when, where's my lunch?
Yeah.
How am I going to get home safe?
Yeah.
All that stuff becomes
Yeah.
pretty critical.
Yeah, and so you certainly can't do what I call intellectual character education without a whole lot of sensitivity to and work on to meet the other social, emotional needs of students. So you've really got to do both and. What I'll say is simply focusing on the emotional and other social and physical, psychological needs of students isn't enough, though, to cultivate these other kind of habits of mind. So you can't, but you can't do intellectual character education without that broader focus, and that's why, you know, on the one hand, I draw a distinction between sort of moral character, intellectual character education, traditional moral character education. But really, in a lot of ways, they go hand in hand because you're talking about whole persons that you're dealing with. Yeah. Hi.
I noticed that your phrase is teaching for intellectual virtue, not teaching intellectual
Yeah,
virtue.
good. Uh-huh.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, I certainly don't think that the primary way that we help students grow in intellectual virtues is by teaching them about intellectual virtues. That said, I do think teaching them about intellectual virtues is really useful. It gives them certain mental categories, certain concepts in which to view the world, negotiate their way through the world, to think about and understand themselves. And these qualities are attractive qualities. So the use of examples and exemplars, teaching students about open-mindedness, giving them rich, compelling examples of these things, helping them understand, what they are, how they're different from intelligence, and also different from moral character, right? That's a kind of knowledge base that I think is really useful for educating for intellectual virtues, but it's just one piece of many, would be my thought. And certainly, a lot of people educate for intellectual virtues very well without ever even having heard the word intellectual virtues, right? All of us have had wonderful teachers, inspiring teachers that have made us more curious and intellectually courageous and thoughtful, right? Well, they were doing intellectual character education, just not quite as explicitly as I'm suggesting we might benefit from doing.
Jason, thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.